Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, DPRK leader Kim Jong-un calls off cabinet-level inter-Korean summit, blaming the ongoing U.S.-South Korea military drills targeting at the DPRK. Will the much-anticipated Kim-Trump summit still happen? Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is in Washington to fix trade issues between China and the U.S. Earlier, I speak to some figures from both the economic and trade circles who believe that multilateralism, not protectionism, can solve trade disputes. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with the unexpected, or rather apparently unexpected, postponement of the ministerial level meeting between Pyongyang and Seoul. The DPRK blamed the postponement on the ongoing military exercises between South Korea and the U.S. It calls the drills a flagrant challenge to the declaration made between the North and the South signed during the Inter-Korean Summit in April. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping met today a visiting delegation of officials from the DPRK's ruling Workers' Party. President Xi says this visit is about coming up with the concrete measures to carry out the important consensus from recent meetings with Kim Jong-un. Many are wondering whether the scheduled summit between the DPRK leader and the U.S. President Donald Trump would push through. Before we ask our panel, take a look at this.
Ups and downs. A historical step. A planned dismantlement of a nuclear site. A scheduled meeting between the DPRK and the U.S. And a postponement. That leaves a question mark: what happens next? The DPRK official Korean Central News Agency has slammed the Max Thunder air combat drills between the U.S. and South Korea as a provocation that goes against the trend of warming ties. South Korea said the suspension of the meeting is regrettable,
as it does not match with the fundamental spirit and purpose of the Panmunjom Declaration agreed by the two leaders on April 27th. The South Korean government has a strong will to diligently urge the North to come out to the talks immediately for the peace and prosperity of the Korean Peninsula.
But it may be just the beginning of an unraveling. The DPRK also threw the Kim-Trump meeting in June into doubt, saying the U.S. must stop insisting it unilaterally abandon its nuclear program.
Mr. President, is the summit still on, sir?
U.S. President Donald Trump answered only silence to the reporter's question and walked away.
We will continue to go ahead and plan the meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un.
After a series of positive steps taken in the past few months, the development is the latest sign of a possible backtracking. China's foreign ministry called on all parties to work on mutual trust.
In order to consolidate the détente, all parties concerned should show goodwill and avoid acts that trigger tensions.
Next week, South Korean President Moon Jae-in will meet with U.S. President Donald Trump before the scheduled Trump-Kim meeting. But before that, the situation is touch and go.
You're watching World Insight. A temporary setback or a major challenge to Korean Peninsula diplomacy? Let's ask our panelists with this recently announced postponement of the cabinet level between the North and the South. In our Beijing studio, Teng Jianqun, director for the Center of Arms Control, China Institute of International Studies, has been a scholar working on DPRK issue for a long time. In Medford, we have Sun-Young Lee, a Kim Koo Korea Foundation professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School of Tufts University in the U.S. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., Michael O'Hanlon, who's a senior fellow with the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, also director of research for foreign policy at the Brookings Institution in the U.S. Welcome as well. Let me begin by asking Mr. O'Hanlon, do you think this is just a minor challenge on the way to a summit meeting between the DPRK and the US, or this is the beginning of a series of challenges to come before that meeting ever happens?
Well, of course, we don't really know. But, and by the way, greetings, and it's nice to be with you. And it was nice to be in Beijing last week, which was looking beautiful. And congratulations on your wonderful capital city. But to get to your question, I think that there is a distinct possibility that this is a negotiating effort by President Kim, because what he's basically saying is, you know, it's not going to be that easy. I'm not going to give up all my weapons quickly. There's a reason why we built these, and we're going to have a bit of a back and forth if this process is going to go forward. That's my best guess as to what he's trying to signal. But there's also the possibility that he is now fundamentally uncertain about whether negotiations are even likely to be beneficial to North Korea, and he may be willing to call off the summit rather than risk having too much pressure applied over rapid denuclearization. So I think it's probably a negotiating effort, a ploy to try to raise the price on what he would demand in order to give up his weapons, and also to change our expectations about how fast he might give up his nuclear capability, if at all. But I don't really know, and we'll have to watch and see.
Well, Professor Li, I wonder if you know whether the United States has so far put anything in so-called exchange for the steps that the DPRK has somewhat promised about the DPRK nuclear issue. Is there anything the U.S. has promised or been talking about to the DPRK counterparts?
Well, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo over the weekend talked about, in a very abstract sense, about massive economic investment, not aid, but capital investment to better the lives of the North Korean people, bring the North Korean economy up to the level of the South Korean economy, which of course is a pipe dream. But what North Korea is doing now, this is a special family-honed tactic, playing hard to get. Most of the world, most mortals know that playing hard to get pays in real life. And it was not all that long ago when North Korea was doing this. On January 20th, Hyun Sung-wol, Miss Hyun, the singer and the leader of the North Korean art troupe, canceled the night before she was to visit South Korea, her visit, and then got the South Koreans to be docile, not criticize North Korea. And then she showed up one day later, flashing smiles. And then they did it again 10 days later, canceling a planned joint North Korean, South Korean pop concert in North Korea. So North Korea is playing hard to get. And why? Because Kim Jong-un has effected already a dramatic image makeover from sick puppy, madman, maniac, rocket man. He has now become, quote, very honorable, well-prepared, reasonable person. So why not increase leverage by playing this game?
Increasing leverage on both sides, I guess that's the tactics and the ways of doing a negotiation. But I'm not sure whether Professor Li has answered the question in a direct way. So let me ask you also, Mr. Tang here in Beijing. When DPRK apparently has promised some kinds of roadmap toward denuclearization, has the United States, from your perspective, offering anything that would address the concerns of DPRK, including a security issue, and including the prospect of economic development? I'm not saying after abandoning the nuclear program, but rather during the process of abandoning the nuclear program.
Let's talk in this way. I think this is actually a very tricky moment for the DPRK to announce such a declaration today. And the DPRK officials also gave a very, clear-cut explanation on the position of DPRK at this moment. I think there are two possibilities. The first is that DPRK would like to raise the bargaining price, just before the summit with the United States. So far, the United States has not yet given any promise, only in the rhetoric, something like the economic assistance. But I think the economic assistance and also the trade with DPRK, there are a lot of obstacles. For example, some act adopted by U.S. Congress should be, kicked off first. And I don't think Donald Trump at this moment can give such, promise to DPRK. This is bargaining stake. The second possibility is that there are some obstacles on the way to finalize the agenda on the coming summit between DPRK and the United States. For example, so far we haven't seen the confirmation from DPRK side that the summit will be held in Singapore on June 12th. So this is actually a very crucial moment for DPRK, whether that country can accept such arrangement. So there are a lot of obstacles DPRK is facing.
Right. One of the things, Mr. O'Hanlon, that we are talking about here is the style of this negotiation, the style of a possible agreement if there were any agreement in the future. Whether it's so-called the Libyan style, which is to abandon the nuclear weapons or the elements of nuclear development first, or it goes parallel, which is the both parties, let's just say DPRK and the United States, draw up a blueprint and each have a step-by-step commitment that they should fulfill for one another. And each side watch the other side to do that before an eventual result could come. During the six-party talks, Mr. O'Hanlon, you know that very well. The latter was the approach. And now, are we seeing a juncture in which these two approaches has to be decided, and this is the moment? Mr. O'Hanlon, please.
Well, I still think the step-by-step approach is much more realistic. Neither side trusts the other. So there could never be a deal, for example, where North Korea first gave us all of its nuclear weapons and allowed a complete dismantlement irreversibly of all of its nuclear production infrastructure, and only then do we go to the UN Security Council to lift sanctions. Only then do we start providing economic aid from the World Bank. Whether the United States gives it or not, I wouldn't know. So that's not going to work. North Korea is not going to give everything up and then just trust the rest of us. But you could imagine one big deal in which there was sort of, UN Security Council preparation work that said as soon as the IAEA certifies that the North Korean nuclear arsenal has been dismantled and removed from the country, at that point the sanctions would automatically lift and the following aid package would begin to flow. But I don't even think that's very realistic. So to me, the step-by-step approach, which I outline in 4 key steps: freeze the testing, as they've already done, cap the production, which is the next step, dismantle production capability, like the centrifuges would be the 3rd step, and then the 4th step would be to actually disarm and verifiably return warheads to the international custodianship of some other party. I think those 4 steps are going to have to happen sequentially with inducements along the way.
Yeah. What kinds of commitment from the other side? I really have to go to you, Mr. O'Hanlon, about that, because all over the past few minutes, both you and Professor Li, both of you are in the United States right now, did not help me to understand that what could the United States offer step by step that the DPRK would consider as stakes that they could depend on for their next steps of implementing their disarmament of the nuclear issue. Mr. O'Hanlon.
Well, for my second step, which is the capping, that's a verifiable shutdown of all the plutonium production capability and uranium enrichment capability. When that happens verifiably, then I believe we have to give at least some modest inducements, some humanitarian aid, perhaps, humanitarian aid in the realm of food or medicine. It could be quite generous, but it should stay more or less at a humanitarian level at that point, because a cap, a verifiable shutdown, is not any kind of permanent decision yet.
Okay.
So most of the benefits should come in that third stage, which is the dismantling of the uranium centrifuges, et cetera. And that's when you can start to lift some UN sanctions, for example, allow the Chinese and Russian trade to resume. And then in the 4th stage is when most of the US unilateral sanctions could come off and when economic aid could be provided in larger amounts.
Okay.
That's the basic game plan that I would recommend.
Well, that's interesting because Professor Li, it seems that we're going to have a DPRK US summit, but the US cannot promise the steps by the others, for example, by the international community on what to do about the DPRK issue. The U.S. can promise is what the U.S. can do in a step-by-step plan with the DPRK about the DPRK nuclear issue. Is there something that the U.S., Washington, particularly the Trump administration right now, could promise? I mean, the White House could promise, Mr. Li.
I'm not sure that President Trump or his closest aides even know of this, but there are statutory constraints, conditions for the gradual suspension of U.S. sanctions and the ultimate termination of sanctions in sections 401, 402 of the 2016 North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act. Trump could use this as leverage, could explain to North Korea that you have to take some actions, as Mr. O'Hanlon mentioned. You have to at least cap and start to dismantle your nuclear and chemical biological weapons programs. Then we will suspend for 1 year certain sanctions against your regime. That's the way to go about it. But for the United States to say, if you completely and verifiably and irreversibly dismantle everything, then we'll start some economic investment, that's a non-starter.
Are we once again going back to ground zero in a way, Mr. Tong? I mean, yesterday, once more, it seems that what is at the very beginning of every round of six-party talks, we are seeing right here before a DPRK U.S. summit.
Yeah, I don't think we are approaching the ground zero. This is actually a game played by the two sides, by DPRK and by the United States. I think there are driving forces in the heart of Kim Jong-un and also in the heart of President Donald Trump to have such a summit. This is a big background for the two countries to sit down. And as for DPRK, I'm sure the leaders for decades, they would like to have a direct meeting with the counterpart from the United States. And in the United States, of course, the conservative politicians, they would like to stay away from the DPRK, but Donald Trump is a very specific president for the country, and he would like to win the Nobel Prize and even to have such a meeting with a DPRK leader. And during the campaign in 2016, we still remember he said, a DPRK nuclear is easy. We can solve it by a hamburger, by a phone call. So I think there are driving forces in the heart of the two leaders.
I see. Well, before we see the fireworks of the Nobel Prize, we are seeing the cannons, in fact, of a joint military exercise between South Korea and the United States. The annual South Korea-U.S. Spring Exercises involving Full Eagle 2018 and Max Thunder 2018 drills. Around right now, 11,500 U.S. and some 300,000 South Korean troops taking part in the Full Eagle exercises, which will run for about 4 weeks. Around 1,500 Air Force personnel from the U.S. and South Korea are engaged in the 2-week Max Thunder exercises. According to Professor Li, the DPRK side, this joint exercises between the South and also the United States is somewhat targeting at the North, and therefore the North does not feel comfortable about it, and therefore cannot have this cabinet level discussion and the meeting before the South Korean president heading to the United States. Professor Li, can just the two sides, South Korea and the U.S., postpone the joint military exercises for some time before some concrete discussion could take place? Professor Li.
It's possible. South Korea and the U.S. suspended these large-scale combined military exercises for 3 years in the mid-1990s as a concession in the wake of the 1994 Geneva Accord between the U.S. and North Korea. And as we know, even this year, the two sides, the two countries postponed the start date of these exercises in consideration of the Olympic Games. Now, this North Korean angst over the aerial exercises, the revelation of this news is not sudden. It's been pre-announced, scheduled. North Korea has known about this all along, and Kim Jong-un himself has said on more than 2 occasions this year that he understands the utility of these exercises and he doesn't mind. So this is just a shallow excuse to increase its leverage, especially on the eve of Trump's meeting with South Korean President Moon in Washington next week, putting the onus on the South Korean leader to persuade President Trump to be more flexible. It's quite clever.
Mr. Tang, though, on the other hand, this temporary moment until now seem to have suggesting to us a fact. That is, before a negotiation, particularly a summit, if one side does not feel comfortable, nothing could happen.
Yeah, you're right.
In that way, what can all sides participating in different kinds of negotiation and discussions for the DPRK nuclear issue come up with the acceptable logic in their way of actions and in their way of blueprint for a plan? Professor Tang.
I think the two players in this game, I mean, DPRK and the United States should be patient. We used to say Rome was not constructed in one day. And after decades of confrontation, I think the dispute between the United States and the DPRK, has been there. I don't think the one side could ask the other side to solve all the dispute, for example, to eliminate all the nuclear facilities in DPRK in one day or in 1 month. This is a very good beginning. I think we should maintain the momentum to have a long way to go, to have a roadmap to find a peaceful solution of this dispute. And I do hope the DPRK leaders and the United leaders gave such a consideration to go ahead, not just because only simply a military or some a rhetoric execution from the other side that gave such a good momentum stopped.
All right. At the point, I'm sure, Mr. O'Hanlon, while we are debating about the postponement, many in different countries are working for the possibility of going again to the discussion and open it to that news to the public. But Mr. O'Hanlon, at this point, it also gives us some thoughts about this top level, very top level diplomacy that we have been seeing over the past few months. The presidents of the United States and South Korea, and also the leader of the DPRK directly interacting with one another without yet much groundwork being laid down there before these meetings happen. It seems that we are coming back to the groundwork stage just a few weeks before the summit. So what does this say about the nature of this very top level diplomatic interactions? Will they eventually be the key, or will they eventually realize that going back to the ground level is the way to go? Mr. O'Hanlon, I think that's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the high-level diplomacy was not necessarily bad. It might even have been good, as long as both leaders were trying to stay realistic. So to the extent that President Trump really thought that Kim Jong-un was all of a sudden going to give away his nuclear arsenal in its entirety very fast, that would have been an unfortunate belief. That's still a good goal for President Trump to begin with, as long as he doesn't really expect to achieve it, and he has a backup plan, a staged reciprocal process. Likewise, if Kim Jong-un somehow thought that we are going to lower our military guard when he still has 700,000 troops near the DMZ, when he's probably still enriching uranium as we speak and building more bombs, even if he's not testing them, that would be entirely unrealistic on his part. So if the two leaders now are going to come down from this sort of love fest and all of a sudden face reality, and they were ignoring reality previously, that would be very regrettable, and that could have made the high-level summitry or the high-level engagement of recent months pointless and even counterproductive. On the other hand, if this is just sort of a setback, more of a negotiating play by Kim Jong-un, and it's just in the process of working towards a realistic deal, then I still think it can be part of a favorable process. So I'm not against what's been happening in 2018, especially compared to the alternative of what was happening in 2017.
Yeah. Professor Li, what about your thought here? What's the next? Because it seems the timetable already been set. South Korean president going to the U.S. and then the summit between the North and the U.S. happens. But from now until then, only a few weeks left. I'm kind of feeling in a hurry. I don't know them. What do you think?
I foresee further sequelization, not sure if that's really a proper word, but more sequels of this. North Korea threatening to walk away from meetings in the midst of meetings and also away from scheduled meetings, thus making the US and its allies chase North Korea. It's in North Korea's interest to do this. We've seen North Korea do it for decades. And what North Korea seeks is a negotiation process, not the ultimate resolution of the negotiations, but an open-ended, never-ending negotiation process during which North Korea will be positioned to get the US to terminate and sanctions so that North Korea buys more time to do what it really wants.
All right, before we go, we only got 30 seconds left. Unfortunately, Mr. Tang, what do you think going to be China's role? Final words from you, Mr. Tang.
Of course, China would like to play a very important role in this momentum to maintain the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula, and China will try best to, organize any, forum for the countries concerned to sit down to have a good and frank discussion on the issues on the roadmap of the future of DPRK and the Korean Peninsula.
As China has always been saying, we hope that both sides are walking toward one another. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Teng Jianquan, Sun Yongli, Michael O'Hanlon. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. Second time, a charm, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He in the thick of trade talks in Washington. To help us make sense of these talks, I've spoken to some of the important figures coming from the business and economic circles of different parts of the world who believe multilateralism and not protectionism can solve trade disputes.
In this episode of Travelogue, I travel to the remote mountains of southern China to spend time with the leaders and shamans of an ethnic Dong community. My goal? To unravel the secrets of their extraordinary sky calling festival.
We have come a long way. Changes happen, and fast, from all corners, different lives, voices, and visions. Encouraged to think, enlightened to change. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is on a 5-day visit to the U.S. for the second round of trade talks. Formal meetings begin Thursday. The U.S. economic team, headed by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, will receive Liu. The Chinese Vice Premier's delegation also includes other important members: People's Bank of China Governor Yi Gang, Vice Chairman of the National Development and Reform Commission Ning Zizhe, and Vice Minister of the Commerce Ministry Wang Shaowen, and some of the others. The first round of negotiation was held in Beijing earlier this month, but only a few concrete agreements were made. Earlier, I sat down with Leslie Mastorp, the Vice President of the New Development Bank, who told me the importance of existing global trade system. He emphasized that the economies should sort out their grievance through negotiations within an established multilateral framework. We have a lot of changing situation in our world. The U.S.-China trade issue is one of it. The question is whether the international community would still safeguard the international trade system and also safeguard the world order.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, I would say that there's no question that globalization and trade opening has benefited the world. I think, it's an indisputed fact that the world is better off today with a global trading system that is based on rules, right? So the issue is not so much for what we need now is maybe greater protections. If people are unhappy with the system, I believe, and I'm not a trade specialist myself, but I believe that it has to be negotiated. I don't think that trade wars will benefit anyone. It won't benefit China, it won't benefit the US, it won't benefit any of the large economies, nor will it benefit emerging markets. Whatever changes needs to be made has to be negotiated, because a multilateral system has been established after the Second World War. As you know, Bretton Woods institutions emerged, the World Trade Organization emerged. So I think there are appropriate forums out there to negotiate and define new rules of the game if the rules are outmoded.
But the question is whether that rule is likely to be broken. And that is going to be detrimental to the world, including to multilateral banks like yours. On what basis would you operate?
I think that the multilateral system today is dependent on that kind of broad consensus. I think the idea that one or two countries can dislodge that, it's no longer possible. I mean, the world is so interconnected in so many respects, not just in terms of trade, in terms of finance, global movement of people. Even China or the US or UK, France, EU cannot opt out of what is a global and a multilateral system. Our bank, together with the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, all of these institutions were set up by treaties agreed on by many countries. Right. In the case of the World Bank, 188 countries. In our case, by 5 large economies.
Emerging economies.
And those are multilateral agreements. If one party has some grievances, I think it's important for those to be subjected back to discussions in those forums. But it shouldn't be done outside of the system. I think that's what most people have been saying here over the last 2 days. What I've been hearing, people are saying there is an established system. Let's try and find and modify rules within the system to ensure we can still have prosperous economic growth.
The other party would complain about the inefficiency of those platforms. They would also complain about what they see as unfair reactions from those platforms. How do you see these kinds of more looking internally rather than looking at the bigger picture vision that some of the economies has acquired over the years?
I think all the voices that I've heard today, in all the talks that I've listened to, everyone is saying that increasing protectionism is not the answer. It is not the solution. There might be legitimate problems being raised, but we know for sure that a trade war is a zero-sum game. You will have tit for tat, and it will not take us in any new place where we will be better off. So I think once we move from that starting point, the enabling environment is there to find some consensus.
The 5 members involved in the BRICS that are shareholders of your New Development Bank, I just wonder, within these countries, how much consensus is there to maintain what you have already have, which is the New Development Bank, and also in a way to cultivate this platform so that it play a more significant role, it play a more balanced role?
I think, look, within multilateral relations, countries also have bilateral relations with each other. So the New Development Bank is an embodiment of this desire, this intent by emerging markets to have a bigger voice in the world economy. So the BRICS countries, especially China, India, Brazil, these are large economies that have now claimed a bigger voice. They also have relations with the EU, they have trading partners with the United States, Canada, and other large economies. The two are not inconsistent with each other. It doesn't mean because we are trying to build a greater say for the BRICS countries in the global system that goes against the other relations that exist. What is profoundly negative about what is currently happening is that economic power is being used to exercise, and one should really use public policy and negotiated platforms to resolve issues rather than using force and power.
You're watching World Insight. Later, I also caught up with Jim Rogers, an American businessman who co-founded the Quantum Group of Funds. Let's listen to his insights on the volatile equity markets and his understanding about China-US trade issues. The market has been going up and down since I saw you last time.
Wait, one of the things I've learned is the market always fluctuates. Don't worry. It's
Really?
always going to do that. And for a while, you know, we've been having fluctuations now because of the trade war. I hope that's going to calm down soon. Market will have a rally, be worried about next year and the year after.
But the bear market has always been one of the most important topics. You talk to people, how to prevent it from happening and how to make sure their own financial security before it happens.
Wait, people have been trying to prevent bear markets for 1,000 years, 2,000 years. No one has ever come up with a way. The central bank in America, the head of the central bank, her name was Janet Yellen. She just left. She says we're not going to have any more bear markets again. Now, if you believe her, then you should stop talking to me. She says everything is okay forever now.
How do you see the vulnerability of the American stock markets?
Wait, it's been over 10 years since we've had a bear market in America. Well, 10 years since we had a bear market. Historically, we've had them every 4 to 8 years. We don't have to have them, but we always have. Why not 18 years? I don't know, but we're going to have another bear market, and it's coming fairly soon. Interest rates are going higher.
What does the latest market reactions regarding the trade policy or the intended trade policy say about the stock market? What would you say?
Well, many people investing in the stock market know that trade wars are bad. They know that tariffs are very bad for the economy. Nobody wins trade wars. Nobody ever has. Everybody suffers. And not just the people in it, everybody. Because they're friends, they're neighbors, they're other trading partners. So everybody knows. And when this happens, he starts talking, the market goes down because they understand.
Talking about the trade issue, what should be the steps, Jim, that you could see the two sides should take?
Well, the leader in China started talking about some things that may calm things down. He talked about lowering tariffs. He talked about buying more from abroad. He talked about protecting intellectual property. He's going to lower the tariffs on automobiles. He's going to open the insurance market. He talked about a lot of things, none of which are bad, all of which might calm Trump down.
China has to look around because now China plays bigger responsibilities in the world. And China volunteers to do that. On the other hand, we do see the United States, for example, not necessarily subscribing to the world order after the Second World War anymore, at least not in recent years. So here's a dilemma. If you tangle with the United States, in certain cases, you are not necessarily follow the rules.
Right.
If you follow the rules, but you are being bullied, you have to react. So that is a dilemma. Jim, you got a better idea?
Well, listen, there's no question that America thinks that they know best, that we're the exceptional nation, and what we say you should do, you should do. Now, you may not think it's best, but if we think it's best, too bad. You better do it our way, or we're going to be very angry at you. And
is that going to change?
It has never changed until countries realize they're in decline. I mean, the UK, which used to be 100 years ago, was still the most powerful country in the world. They didn't realize it. Now they realize it. Now they realize that the sun can set on the British Empire. But, you know, it took them a long time to figure out.
Some have been talking about that China, no matter what is going on in the United States, or no matter what is going on between China and the United States, China should stick to its own blueprint and never misstep because what the others were trying to do. Do you agree with that?
Well, everybody should do that, yes, but there's a time when you have to react. If you walk outside and it's snowing and you don't have on a coat, you got to put on a coat. You have to react to some things no matter what. And yes, China, listen, China's been the most successful country in the past 35 years in the world. There's no question about that. Maybe I know I would have done some things differently, but China doesn't need me. They've done a very good job without me. So if I were China, I would try not to react as much as they have. But they have to react some. China's been doing a great job, doing it its own way. I would do some things differently, but who cares? Continue to do it your way.
You got a lot of Chinese philosophies going on over there in your answer, Jim, I have to say.
Well, listen, China's been around a long time. I am an admirer of Chinese history, Chinese culture. I mean, anybody who studies Chinese culture and history has to admire what your history and what you've done. There have been plenty of mistakes, plenty of disasters, plenty of catastrophes. You've been around a long time.
Yes.
You've been around long enough to make many, many mistakes. You know, in the U.S., we've only been around to less than 300 years. So we don't have the history and the mistakes that you have made and the triumphs that you've had.
Right.
The 19th century was the century of the UK. The 20th century was the century of the US. The 21st century is the century of China. Whether we like it or not, and there are a lot of people who don't like it, who do not like that China's rising again.
Your two daughters, they are darlings. They're amazing, Jim, I have to say. Studying Chinese, learning Chinese culture, and almost become stars on Chinese TV.
I know.
Are you envious?
My children are making me famous this way because they're so good in Chinese and so good on TV.
一帆风顺，二龙腾飞，三娘开泰，四季平安，五福临门，六六大顺，七星高照，八方来财，九九同心，十全十美。
I didn't know they were going to be this good. Never occurred to me in a million years they would be so good at it, but it's certainly not my fault. I speak no Chinese, none, none.
Have they talked to you about what fascinated them the most when they're learning the language, when they're learning the songs?
They didn't learn the language way. They just, I took the little one, the older one to Shanghai when she was 2, and people would run up to her and say to her in Chinese, "How'd you learn Chinese?" She didn't know what they were talking about. She didn't learn Chinese. You didn't learn Chinese. I didn't learn English. We just grew up.
Pick it up.
We just grew up speaking like everybody else.
What did they tell you about China? What fascinates them the most?
Well, so far what fascinates them is the language. They love the language, which I have no comprehension of. They love the food. They love the pop stars. You know, they love the fashion people. They've already learned about fashion. Their mother's into fashion. So no, they just love Chinese life and Chinese. They go to school. They're the only blue-eyed kids in the school. You know, there are 3,000 people with black hair and black eyes. And they stand out, but it doesn't seem to bother them.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.